Hi guys, welcome back to Compast, where we use history to reflect on the present day. In the previous episode, we looked at how systems of decision making in Mao's China weren't set up to listen to scientific experts. And we compared that to contemporary systems of climate policy making, namely the IPCC guidance and the summary report. In this episode, we're going to look at Maoism from a couple of other angles. What went wrong under Mao, and what might that tell us about our own systems for implementing climate policy. There was a disconnect under Mao between the creator of the policy in Beijing, Mao, and the implementers of the policy on the ground in the localities. The local party bosses couldn't implement Mao's policies and also couldn't communicate that reality back to him. When agricultural production failed to match the quotas he'd set for them in Beijing, officials failed to report the reality of the failure. Instead, quotas were collected as though they'd been reached, leaving nothing for the peasants. No one dared to question Mao's supposed genius, so they told him the policy was working, and it continued long after it should have been stopped. Okay, so we can see that in Mao's China, there was a problem with implementation. There was a disconnect between decision makers in Beijing and people on the ground who were supposedly making those decisions happen. Now let's have a look at our own present day approach to a new type of technological problem. So how does our society try to implement sustainable policies regarding climate? And is there a comparable disconnect between the decisions, policies, and the aims of the state on one hand and the actual implementation of those aims on the ground? The private companies inspect themselves, in effect. They are paying private inspectors, consultancy firms, to come in and assess whether they are actually implementing sustainability policies effectively. And the fees that fund those consultancy firms are paid by the companies themselves. This means that state policymakers are neither imposing sustainable behavior on private companies by law or independently assessing whether those companies are actually implementing sustainable policies effectively. I've spoken to the heads of sustainability in a couple of really big companies, and it's clear by their own admission in private that their approach as it stands is not capable of solving the problems we're facing. It is, in the words of one, a good friend, he says it's tinkering at the edges of capitalism. His job, at the point when I discussed it with him in 2023, was to make sure his company could work out what it was it had to do to be able to demonstrate its own sustainability to the inspector. His only concern was with what the inspector was going to make of his company. So his job was to put together a report, a portfolio, things the company was doing to actually please that inspector. I asked him, well, who is this inspector? Are they coming in from the government? Are they going to impose legal consequences on you if you fail to achieve that criteria that they're setting for you? Funnily enough, he didn't actually know. So at the point he was at in the company, he was head of sustainability for a large telecommunications company, and he actually didn't even need to know who the inspector was, whether they had state authority or private operators. But when I dug down into it, he told me that the assessors were coming from consultancy firms. From Ampersand, and the big four consultancy firms were also moving in on this action of this sustainability industry that was developing. When you look into it, these firms are not government actors. They're not independent state inspectors that can impose legal repercussions on the company. They are privately funded. They're funded by the company itself, and their job is to rubber stamp what the company's doing. When you really dig down into it, my friend's job as head of sustainability was to make sure that the company was marketing itself as a sustainable company. It was paying inspectors, paying an outside company to come in and rubber stamp its sustainability policies. It was like a necessary adjunct to the company's core business. It's not part of the way the company makes its money, which is the main driver of the company's behavior. But it is this issue of sustainability is a potential threat to its reputation that the company understands it has to see off. So heads of sustainability are actually left in reality in a difficult position. They're usually, even in very large companies like my friend's, without any full-time staff assigned to them. He had no one that he was actually line managing, but he also had to go to important people, to the very, very top of the company. These people are ultimately answerable to their profit targets, and that's what's driving. And he had to assign extra tasks to these people. The head of sustainability is then required to pester and annoy these important people by giving them extra things to do. These sustainability departments are engaged in working out for themselves their own criteria for judging their own sustainability. They are, at the same time, interpreting summary guidance emanating from the annual COP, Conference of the Parties meetings of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which they know will also be guiding their assessment. The problems with power and funding at that level were explored in the previous episode. Neither the criteria used to judge the companies or the process for assessing whether they fulfill those criteria is independent of the influence of the companies themselves. Under Mao, China was paralyzed by fear of Mao's personal rule. The present-day West is paralyzed by the influence of money, but the implications are comparable. Failure to consult experts and also a failure to assess policies is always a recipe for disaster. I'm now going to move on to the third and final part of my Mao comparison or Maoism. I'm now going to look at the way that isolating specific mechanisms causes a failure to recognize the scale or complexity of the technological challenge. So the comparison I'm going to make now between Mao and present-day sustainability policies is to do with isolating mechanisms. Under Mao, the technological situation was that he needed to industrialize in order to maintain the political independence of China, but his understanding of what that meant was limited to notions of isolated mechanisms within industrialized society. He understood industrialization to mean massively increased steel production and massively increased food production. He isolated certain elements of what were the industrial societies that he was looking at from the outside. In reality, in order to industrialize, you need a whole ecosystem of change. You need to completely transform the entire society. You need a system of logistics and transportation and communication. You need urban infrastructure in order to house and maintain the workforce that's going to be working in the factories producing the goods. You need a fully developed education system to supply sufficiently educated workers to be able to do the technical tasks and the specialisms that are required for an industrial society. Mao could not achieve his targets simply by aiming for them in isolation. So he couldn't take a non-industrialized society and make it produce the amount of steel that an industrialized society would produce. He could not take a peasant society and simply push it to work harder to produce the amount of food that an industrialized society with mechanized agriculture, land that's been heavily invested in. He couldn't achieve the aims that he had because he was isolating specific mechanisms within industry and trying to achieve those on their own. The steel that was produced was of very low quality and unusable. It was produced in village steel mills that were melting down pots and pans and turning them into just junk that could not be used for anything. The agricultural development that he was attempting to implement by mobilizing the peasantry ended in disaster with famine. It can also be said that we have narrowed a bigger problem with the technological situation in such a way that we're unable to respond successfully to its real demands. Our misunderstanding of our situation stems from the notion that the negative consequences of technological advance are isolated in specific forms of technology. In actual fact, the problems we face are not technical problems with isolated mechanisms in nature, like climate or seawater quality. They are negative consequences of technological development, which has reached a level of power to affect natural process in ways that threaten our physiology. When understood as multiple symptoms of our levels of technology, it might be possible to actually change the way we're approaching research, development, and utilization of technology. But as long as we're kidding ourselves that these issues are specific and isolated and can be dealt with one by one through isolated responses to each challenge, our chances of success are as limited as Mao's were. The fact that ecosystems are faced with multi-front technological threats is broadly accepted fact, but these multiple simultaneous challenges exist in simultaneous multiplicity because they are all symptoms of our levels of technological advancement without effective systems for curtailing the research, development, and utilization of technology. The principal industrial threat identified up to this point has been climate change, but others, including plastic, forever chemicals, genetically modified pandemic diseases, artificial intelligence, the individual and societal impacts of social media, are also in the process of being understood. To isolate each individual technological threat and attempt to head it off individually is doomed to failure. If the level of technology is the problem, then the only viable solution is a change in approach to technology in general. In our case, that means we need to reflect our decision-making system. They need to become capable of reacting precisely and quickly to the science when negative consequences of advanced technology rear their head. And it also means that we need to reform our systems for managing and regulating the research, development, and utilization. Central to any successful reform would have to be changes to the workings of the patent system. The patent system provides one example of what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the approach that we have to the direction of technology. The approach we have to technology affects technological reality. So the patent system provides one example of that point. The patent system is a system we've designed to direct researchers and developers of technology in a particular way. The way that the patent system directs us towards those kinds of solutions is at the expense of the types of solutions we usually often need. The patent system tells the researcher who's developing the technology that they can only profit from that technology if they develop something which is a novel artifice, something that's never been made before, that is clearly distinct from anything that exists already. So straight away, all our focus when it comes to finding the solutions to the problems that we face are directed away from naturally occurring substances, things that exist already, towards new and novel and more advanced forms of technology. This is a system that we've developed. This is a system that was created in the 19th century, and I'm going to look into more detail at the patent system in another episode. I realise that saying that climate change or microplastics or forever chemicals can't be dealt with in isolation might seem like an outlandish claim or an unrealistic one, but I assert dealing with industrial outputs in isolation has as much chance of success now as it did in Mao's time. In order to build that argument, I'll need to zoom out and start to do some big picture thinking about what has changed since the initial stages of the industrial era. I'm going to get started on that in the next episode. So I will see you guys next time. Thanks for listening. This video is based on an extract from a book I've written called Recovery, which looks into history for guidance about how Western societies can recover from the range of problems they now face. I'm looking for help in getting this published. Click over to my Kickstarter page for more details. Thanks a lot, guys, and I'll see you next time.